WashingTECH.
I would really love to see more design research and human-centered research more broadly in policy.
Are you worried about your kids' safety on the internet? We are here to help. WashingTECH's 5-step checklist will take you through the process of protecting your kids. And we'll give you tips on how to set up the best parental controls for your children on their devices. You want what's best for your children. They deserve to be safe online. Our step-by-step guide will help you make sure they are. Download WashingTECH's online safety checklist today to protect your kids online. Find it at protectyourkids.online. That's protectyourkids.online.
Welcome to the Tech Policy Leaders Podcast.
The world's most influential voices keeping you safe and informed online.
Streaming from Washington, D.C., America's tech law and policy epicenter. These are your leaders. This is the podcast.
Tech Policy Leaders with Joe Miller, founder and CEO of WashingTECH.
WashingTECH, safe and informed since 2014.
My guest today is Dr. Michal Luria. She's a researcher at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Her work makes use of immersive and human-centered design research methods to envision and critique interactions with emerging technologies. In her work, she translates research insights into thought-provoking interactions and necessary discussions of ethics and policy. So what was that aha moment for you, Dr. Luria, when you decided to investigate interactions between computers and humans?
So I was a media studies student, and a lot of the work that I studied focused on, going into technology and its impact on society and criticizing it. And I think at some point when I was talking to my peers and other people about this, it felt like, yes, we're criticizing this, we're understanding like all the ways in which it changed society, but what's next? Like, what do we do about it? And it always felt like I was hitting a wall when I would try to think about, where's this critique going? Like, what am I suggesting? And so during my studies, I eventually joined a lab that was on the more proactive side of things, and combining design and human-computer interaction research as a way to not only identify what is wrong or what we think should be changed, but also to suggest actual ways forward and to progress technology or nudge technology in a direction that we're more excited about or that we think better fits our values. And so that is also the perspective that I bring to the Center for Democracy and Technology, in addition to kind of pointing out where we think the problems are, to also suggest, okay, what do we do next? How can we change this?
Yeah, and it looks like you have that great combination between quantitative and creative skills because, when we're talking about the problems in policy, to recommend solutions, we really need some really high level skills. And, it's like we have to invest that time and energy up front to gain those skills just so we can, make things simple, which is one of the fantastic things I saw in your report. And, this sort of ties back to the Supreme Court. Let's give that background first. And the Supreme Court recently agreed to hear Gonzalez v. Google, a case in which the family of Noemi Gonzalez, an American citizen murdered by members of the Islamic State in a brutal terror attack in Paris back in 2015. It was a series of attacks in Paris over a couple of days in November of that year that left 131 people dead. And the Gonzalez family is arguing in this case that Google bears at least partial responsibility for their daughter's death, since its content algorithm recommended ISIS recruitment videos to individuals who'd previously watched ISIS-related videos and things like that. And so the lower courts are sort of split on this issue of whether Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which generally shields platforms like Google from liability for content posted by other people, third parties. But the issue is whether Section 230 also applies just when platforms recommend content. So it's one thing if someone's posting to the platform someone else, but then it's another thing if Google's algorithm is going in there and saying, no, highlighting it at the top of your feed. So ultimately, what this case is about is whether recommending content based on what people are actually viewing is a form of editorial discretion. And if it is, does that legally shift platforms right? Does that legally shift platforms that would otherwise be immune from liability under Section 230 into the role of being content creators as opposed to being more of a neutral platform? And that brings us to your report. After all that, now I can shut up. But it seems more focused on giving users more control over the recommendations appearing in their search results and feeds.
Right.
Is that correct? Because my instincts are telling me that giving users more control over their recommendations might help insulate companies like Google, but that's probably just one way to look at it, because there are civic concerns here that go beyond just kind of mitigating these effects just to limit Google's liability. There are some societal benefits here as well.
Well, I think, the whole Section 230 question is quite complicated, but I think in this work, we're not suggesting or giving users more control over the recommendations and what they see does not mean that we're taking responsibility away from companies. It's not directly related in this specific context, because we're actually asking companies for even more responsibility. We're asking them to not only make responsible decisions on how they moderate their content, we're also asking them to provide tools for their users to be in the loop, to understand what is happening, and to be able to control to some extent what it is that they see. So I think that it doesn't replace their accountability here, but rather it suggests that there's another audience that they should be addressing, and those are their end users that should have more transparency about what is happening and how the platform is making decisions about what it is that they will see.
And so tell us more about why, what kind of triggered this idea for you? Was there a particular experience that you had that made you say, hey, I really want to look deeper into kind of looking at this human-centered design approach, and I want to bring that to policymaking? Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on sort of your career path around sort of combining these two things?
Yeah, I think the way that I see it, human-centered design research is inherently democratic. It really prioritizes people's needs and values, and it tries to create discussion and dialogue with all the different stakeholders within a particular platform or interaction. It can bring underrepresented voices into the conversations. So it really has a lot of benefits in actually going out and talking to people. And I would argue that that is also, to some extent, what policy is about, right? Getting opinions out there and bringing, a bunch of different stakeholders to have a conversation and to make the decision that would be best for that community. And so I think that human-centered design can really support the policymaking process in many ways. And in this specific project, we also made use of prototyping, which I think is a kind of a whole other separate case for why this could be valuable. I think that design and human-centered research is already entering policymaking, especially in places like the UK. There are a lot of organizations that do particularly that. Prototyping is even one step further, right? It's suggesting, it's not only talking to people, not only ethnographic research will get us those insights, but maybe let's also put more design work in. Let's create things. Let's work with people to co-design what their experiences should be in policymaking. And so I think that there's a lot of problems to resolve to make that process work well. But I think there could be many benefits. And so part of our work at CDT, we're trying to really find ways in which that would work well. And what are the spaces in which design research can really provide benefit in the process of policymaking.
And you have 4 prototypes for what the user interface would look like for this, and I want to get to those. Mm-hmm. But first, let's talk about your findings in this report, because they're super, super critical for folks working in this space. Yeah. And the subjects for the study placed greater emphasis, according to your research, on wanting to know why they were seeing the recommendations that they were seeing, as opposed to wanting to know more about what kinds of things were excluded from their feeds. So how do policymakers play a role here? For an ordinary person, an ordinary user, perhaps information about what's being omitted from their feeds isn't top of mind. But when we look at history, and particularly in a civil rights and social justice context, there are lots of things local governments want to exclude people from knowing. They're banning books. They're telling teachers what they can and cannot say about sexuality in the classroom. So I'd hate for this conclusion for folks to misinterpret it and say, well, folks don't need to know what they don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Joe, I think that's a really good point and worth also discussing here. And so part of the report, we bring forward what people cared most about having in a transparency report about how their recommendation algorithm works, and what are things that people don't care about as much. And so even when we talk to platforms as well, we're really going out of our way to emphasize that is not to suggest that this information should not be out there, right? So we say that one of the things that people cared less about, like what you said, the information that is filtered out. But we know that this is a problem. It can create filter bubbles, other problems that we want to mitigate. And so in this report, we really emphasize that we're talking about end users, everyday users, and what they want to see in a report that would be most engaging for them, which would provide the best answers for the questions that they already have. But there are many other audiences that want to know more about recommendation algorithms, right? There are researchers, policymakers, audits. There are many people who need more answers from platforms. And what we say in the report is that there is no single answer here, right? There's no catch-all format, because really there are all kinds of audiences. And the only way to address all these different audiences is to produce separate reports for different audiences. So we recommend to platforms a set of topics that would benefit end users most. And those are the ones that we state in the report. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't share other information, like what is being filtered out, but that is not the right place for it, right? So there should be kind of a space for other topics as well. But we do want to avoid having too much information for users. We know that there's an overload of information that can happen when if platforms were to just list all the information they have about users, there is no way that they could make sense of it, or any person, right? It really needs to be formatted in a way that's digestible to people. And then for other stakeholders, the information needs to be packaged in other ways. And so I think the key here is that platforms should understand who their audiences are and which audience needs what information and for what reason. Not to say that this information should be completely omitted, because of course we want platforms to be as transparent as possible.
So super, super granular.
Yeah. Other interesting findings that I'll share is a finding about the desire to know more about what personal data is being used. So the study focused on how recommendation algorithms work, not about data collected necessarily, but people kept coming back to asking about how their personal data impacts that algorithm and how their data is being used. And so there's really a strong connection here to trying to understand how an algorithm would impact people. I think a lot of the conversation that we saw in the study was that people have a sense that all this information that is being collected about them is going to harm them at some point, somehow, but they're not really sure how. I think many people, not only end users, but many other people in other fields, are not really quite sure yet exactly how those impacts would look like. And so we found that people were actually quite comfortable with having algorithms, but they want to know more about exactly what data is being collected and how it is used for the algorithm. And then on the other side of that, how it would impact them potentially in the future.
Awesome. So now if users did have more access to, and I say awesome because I can't, the brilliance right now is just, I can't even deal. But if users did have more access to the data platforms use about them to make recommendations, what would that look like? And this brings us to the prototypes. I mean, you can't just be a wall of text like these privacy policies that no one reads, right?
Yes.
So how would you describe for your 4 prototypes for communicating this information to users without too many spoilers, because we've linked to the report in the show notes, but even to make this more accessible to folks who are visually impaired? How are you thinking about visualizing this information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I agree with you. I think it definitely should not look like privacy policies do. And I think that platforms are really good at making great experiences for people, but more effort should be spent in these spaces of providing algorithmic transparency. And so in our work, the second part of the report, we generated prototypes as part of the study. And those prototypes were not we didn't create a template for what should be, but rather they were intended as a starting point. Based on the findings of the first part, we created some ways that we think that algorithmic transparency reports might look like. And then we also used them as research probes, and we went back to participants and discussed what they see, what they feel works, what doesn't work, and so forth. And so in these prototypes, we focused on several elements that kind of kept coming through in all of them, that these prototypes should be interactive, very data-oriented, playful in some places. And I think that these elements could work, for people who are visually impaired. This also, there are other ways to make this information available that's not necessarily visualization. And so, for example, one of the things that we explored was a plug and play feature where people see the data that they provided to a platform and they see a set of specific bits of content that they saw on their feed. And so people can edit the information that's the input information. And as a result, that these posts will directly change. And that way people can learn about exactly which element impacts what results in their feed. And in that way, learn more about how the algorithm works. And so being able to kind of explore and play around with elements in a more visual way, in a more data-driven way, it really can help answer questions that people have in a way that they, they're not confronted with this long block of text that is very hard to decipher. It's more like the nice experiences that platforms know how to create for people, the user-friendly experiences that are in many places, and just taking the knowledge that designers and researchers have in other areas of a platform and applying more of that in these places, I think would really benefit users.
Fantastic. Well, what are some final ideas, Dr. Luria, that you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online?
Well, I think beyond the study that really focused on end users and creating algorithmic transparency reports, I would really love to see more design research and human-centered research more broadly in policy. I definitely see more and more labs popping up, more groups that are doing this kind of work. So it's really great to see. And I hope that this will be, the trend will continue moving forward, because I really think there is a very important contribution that empathy-based research can bring to policymaking. You can find me on Twitter and, just on all the other places online, Google Scholar, etc.
Dr. Michal Luria is a researcher at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Michal, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Joe. It was great being here.